Hello, all. Thank you for joining. We're really happy to have you here this afternoon. This is the Friends from the Field webinar series, and this is a collaboration between Blue Hill Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust. My name is Megan Flanagan, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator at Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and we're thrilled to have you all here. We have a large archive of these presentations on the Blue Hill Heritage Trust YouTube channel, and I think you can also access the videos on the Island Heritage Trust website. So we invite you to look at any past presentations, and we hope to see you at future presentations this year. They occur monthly, and you can check either the Blue Hill Heritage Trust or Island Heritage Trust websites for more information. So Noelle, feel free to take it over from here.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Noelle Ruth. I'm the Outreach Manager for Island Heritage Trust. Megan's going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker this evening in a moment, but what I'm going to share is that during the presentation, if any questions come up for you, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and Megan and I will read them at the end of the presentation if we have time for a little Q&A with Ron. And I also want to mention that if you would like support with listening, there's the ability to show captions on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you click show captions, you'll be able to see in text what our speaker is sharing.
Great. Thank you, Noelle. So I'd like to introduce Ron Butler. He's an ecologist interested in issues related to the conservation of biological diversity. During his early career, he conducted research primarily with seabirds in Maine, Newfoundland, and Antarctica. In the second half of his career, he changed over to a focus on ecologically important groups of insects. And for the past 25 years, he's helped to coordinate statewide citizen science initiatives on Maine's dragonflies, butterflies, and bumblebees. And we're really excited to have him here this evening. So Ron, if you would like to start your presentation, go for it.
Thank you. Give me a thumbs up if you see that.
Yep.
Okay, great. So, as Megan said, I want to, qualify my presentation by starting with the confession that I'm not an entomologist. I am an ecologist, and the early part of my career was spent, studying seabirds. And I did that for a number of decades before trading cold, wind-swept islands off the coast of Maine, Newfoundland, and a couple of years Antarctica for insects that like nice, warm, sunny days. So in the early 90s, I switched gears and collaborated with biologists at the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife on several long-term community science initiatives. The first of those was the Maine Damselfly and Dragonfly Survey, the second, the Maine Butterfly Survey, and the third, the recently concluded Maine Bumblebee Atlas. We have, after 17 years, pulled together 17 years of data from the Butterfly Survey in this book that was just released this month. And that's pretty much what I'll be focusing on tonight. We're presently pulling together the results of the Dragonfly Survey in a second book, which will be entitled Damselflies and Dragonflies of Maine and the Canadian Maritime Provinces. I like both of these groups because damselflies and dragonflies and butterflies are iconic. Bees to a lesser extent, but these two groups are iconic. You can find cultural references to them in every culture on the planet. And when I look across cultures and try to see the commonalities that are attributed to these insects. So I'm talking about butterflies specifically now. I tend to find a dichotomy between references to spirits, souls, ancestors, supernatural entities, and birth and transformation. So those tend to be the two dichotomies. There's some other, good and bad fortune in some cultures and so forth, but those tend to be kind of repeating themes that I find. So what you can see on the screen is a Pompeian mosaic that's a couple thousand years old. And basically, and I hope you guys can see my cursor, it's the message here is death is the great leveler between the wealthy and the poor. And the reason I portray this is because represented in this mosaic as the soul is a butterfly. We certainly, in more contemporary culture, can find references to butterflies in all sorts of media. Wines and beers, artwork, insect collections, samurai armor, yard art, sculpture, body art, airplanes or aircraft, watercraft, weapons, very popular pub name, as it turns out, and very popular cafe name. We also see quite popular and probably in almost every major city in the country, the existence of butterfly gardens. These are generally indoor exhibits, but often are merged with outdoor exhibits as well to attract local breeding species of butterflies during the season. And again, these tend to be really wonderfully attractive exhibits, very popular, at least the ones that I've been able to visit. In another context, we find that in those cultures which practice entomophagy, that is, consumption of insects for food, butterflies also appear on the menu. So if we kind of look at a study of contemporary consumption of insects as food, we find caterpillars, and these often are butterfly caterpillars, represent one of the larger components for those cultures that actually eat insects. I will say that in many of these cases, it's the larvae that are consumed, but there are also adult insects. In the case of butterflies, they tend to be caterpillars rather than adults. So this is the tequila giant skipper or giant tequila skipper. You see it both ways in the literature. It looks like this as larvae. It looks like this in the wild. So butterflies have a long history interwoven with cultures of humans on the planet. That said, butterflies predate humans by hundreds of millions of years, at least 100 million years. If we talk about the evolution of Lepidoptera, and when I talk about the Lepidoptera, I mean both moths and insects, we have to recognize, as is the case for most insects, there's a poor fossil record. Insects don't fossilize very well. They don't have bones, they don't have teeth. We get great fish, reptile, mammal, even amphibian fossils. We get fair bird fossils, but we don't get good insect fossils. No, we do actually get some. So this is an insect fossil from 35 million years before present. It is clearly a butterfly. There are several hallmarks that make that the case. But generally, the fossil record is poor. So what we know about the evolution of this group is derived both from the sketchy fossil record that we do have and genomics, that is, studying the genomes of various contemporary species, looking at more primitive and more advanced, and casting that in the context of the known rates of changes of evolution of molecules over time. So what we can say about moths and butterflies is the oldest moths appear about 300 million years ago. The first butterflies about 200 million years later. Now, it's clear that butterflies are derived from moths, that moths were largely nocturnal, that a group of moths became diurnal, daytime flying, and those were the ancestors of today's butterflies. Why that happened is debatable, but the best evidence that we have suggests that bees may have driven the evolution of butterflies by the close coevolution of bee and flowering plants. The exploitation of pollen in flowering plants that help propagate flowering plants open the door in an evolutionary sense to more and more varieties of flowering plants, different structures in terms of the flowers themselves, different presentation of the rewards to attract pollinators. And here I'm talking about nectar, in some cases oils. And that sort of opened the door for a new group of previously night-flying moths to start exploiting those same resources. So it may be that bees actually open the evolutionary door for the evolution of butterflies. So within the order Lepidoptera, Lepido referring to scales, Ptera, Ptera referring to wing, we have both moths and butterflies. And that order of insects is divided into 4 suborders. We're concerned with only one of those, the largest, the Glossata. These are the moths and butterflies that have a coiled process. And that's 99% of all known species. So they're about 165,000. I say plus because new ones keep being named on almost a daily basis. Species of moths and butterflies, and contrary to popular belief, 90% of all Lepidoptera are moths. So butterflies are only 10% of the total number of species. But that proboscis, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner, is fully extended, as we see in this little peck skipper, for feeding. The rest of the time, when the animal is generally in flight, that's kept coiled, as you can see in this electron micrograph. So within the suborder that contains both moths and butterflies, we find smaller taxonomic groups called infraorders. And there are 6 of those, and the one that we're concerned with are the Heteroneura, and these are the moths and butterflies. And within that infraorder, we then have 40 superfamilies. The one we want to focus on, the Papilionoidea, are just the butterflies and skippers. In that superfamily, there are 7 families of butterflies, 5 of which we have in our region. So most people who view butterflies like to watch their behavior, but they also like to identify them. And of course, butterfly identification is made easier than in many insect species because of the brightly colored patterns that we see on both the upper wing and the lower wing. And again, in any butterfly guide, you'll see diagrams such as these. These are from the book that we just released. But you need to pay attention to the fact that many butterflies have very contrasting dorsal or upper wing patterns as compared to their ventral or lower wing patterns. So these are the same species in each case, and you can see quite a difference in the pattern. That color pattern, of course, is due to hollow scales on the wings of butterflies. You can't see them very well. It's kind of butterfly wings. If you look closely, see you're a little granular, but it's not until you really get close and maybe even use a microscope or electron microscopy that you get the impression that these color patterns are actually due to these tiny little hollow scales that exist on the wings of the animals. The butterfly life cycle, as any grade school kid will gladly share with you, generally includes the egg, several growth phases of the larva, also called caterpillars, the formation of a pupa, also referred to as a cocoon or a chrysalis, and then finally the emergence from that pupal casing of the adult. So that is the typical life cycle for these guys. They are what we call holometabolic insects. They go undergo this complete metamorphosis. And what goes on in this stage is nothing short of biological magic, where the tissues of the caterpillar, with the exception of the nervous system, essentially dissociate, almost liquefy, and tissues that form one function in the caterpillar cannot be assigned a completely different function in the adult. It's a really amazing and still not well understood process to go from this thing to this thing. That is this to this. The generation time from egg to adult, how long does that last? Well, it depends. They're generally short, generally 1 to 2 months. So that means the life stages, egg, larval, pupal, adult, tend to be brief, in weeks. The exception is whichever stage overwinters. Those stages tend to be much longer, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So with that exception, the overwintering stages tend to be long, and in those species that breed multiple times in one season. So we have 1, 2, 3 generations. The stages become even shorter as a result. In terms of feeding, the larvae tend to be specialists. So butterfly caterpillars tend to feed on only one family of plants. Now, most people often hear that, well, butterfly caterpillars only feed on a single species of plant. That's very rare. So we all say, well, milkweed, butterflies, monarchs feed on milkweed, right? Well, yeah, but 12 or more species of milkweed. Right? Adults, on the other hand, tend to be generalists. Adults will nectar, and in some cases, in a few families, actually feed on pollen from a wide variety of sources. But some species will actually feed on sap or rotting fruit or animal carcasses or feces and urine. Okay, so butterflies can feed on more than what we normally think of them doing when we see them nectaring in our gardens. In terms of the overwintering stages of butterflies, the strategies that we see, it depends on the species. And I won't even say it depends on the family, because sometimes we find families do more than one thing. Species in the same family do more than one thing. So basically, butterflies overwinter either as eggs, larvae, pupae, adults, or they don't overwinter in the sense that they stay here. So, for example, monarchs don't stay here. They migrate. Right? So again, eggs, larvae, pupae, or adults if they stay, or adults if they migrate. And we often think about the magnificent migration that monarchs make, especially in the east coast of North America and the Midwest, migrating largely down through into central Mexico in what is a generational migration. And in other words, a single animal doesn't make the whole trip. It's several generations involved. But that isn't even the most spectacular migration. The most spectacular migration is the European lady, which may migrate from Northern Europe down into equatorial Africa and back again. So that's a really spectacular migration. So again, the point I want to make here is we think of monarchs migrating, but we have a number of butterflies in Maine that migrate. Ecological significance. Well, butterflies, like a number of other insects, are important in terrestrial food webs. They play the role of decomposers, both as larvae and adults in some cases. They are certainly herbivores as larvae. They are prey species in all their life stages for a number of both invertebrate and vertebrate predators. They are hosts in all their life stages for a number of parasites or parasitoids. Adults, we certainly know, are nectivores, but we also know that they can feed on carcasses, and they can feed on feces, and they can feed on sap, and so forth. So important roles, both as a food source and as a consumer in terrestrial ecosystems. Pollinators, goes without saying, a very important group of pollinators. And probably one people don't think about much is the role of ecological indicator. The health of butterfly populations is often directly related to the health of the plant assemblages that they're exploiting, and those plant assemblages in turn are healthy or not based on the environmental conditions that those plants are germinating and growing. So 3 important roles for butterflies. One of the questions I frequently get when I give these presentations is how to tell the difference between butterflies and moths, and particularly those diurnal, those A-flying moths, right? And the rule of thumb that butterflies are mostly diurnal and moths are mostly nocturnal, we know isn't true because we see these guys around quite frequently, right? That's a moth. What most people don't understand is there's a small family of nocturnal butterflies. So the daytime, nighttime thing doesn't work. Another one I frequently hear is, well, butterflies rest with their wings vertically, moths with their wings horizontally. Right? Except that's vertical, that's horizontal. That doesn't work. Okay, moths are generally fuzzier than butterflies. Well, there's a really fuzzy moth, and there's a moth that doesn't appear fuzzy at all. And I can show you some pretty fuzzy butterflies. This guy's pretty fuzzy. If you look at this guy closely, he's pretty fuzzy too. Right? Moth flight is more erratic than butterfly flight. That's true. And that has to do with the fact that the wings of moths can't flap independently because they're joined by this little structure called a frenulum. But that's a hard thing to judge unless you can actually watch a butterfly and a moth fly side by side to see which one is erratic and which one is more graceful. The one thing that will work almost always is to look at the antennae, because butterflies have what we call antennal clubs, and moths generally do not. So you can see a wide variety of moth antennae here, but none of them have that clear antennal club that you can see on this butterfly. So that's a pretty good clue. If we consider the distribution and diversity of butterflies on the planet, what we find is they're basically found on all continents except Antarctica. The genomic studies published in 2023 by the group in Florida suggest that, surprising to most people because of the diversity of butterflies in the tropical regions of the world, is that butterflies apparently evolved in the Americas. They have, in fact, reached now their greatest diversity in the subtropics and tropics, and that's what you see basically represented here. And their lowest diversity in Greenland, where there are only 6 known species that are residents. As I said, about 165 known species of moths and butterflies, about approaching 19,000 species of butterflies known worldwide. 815 species North Mexico. Only about 575 of these occurring regularly in the lower 48, and about 275 species occurring regularly in Canada. Now, the difference in these two numbers has to do with butterflies that are transients, are vagrants. They can be recorded, but they're actually not breeding in the lower 48. They've just moved up with, tropical air masses or in search of food, or they've wandered across the border between Texas and Mexico at some point and get recorded. Well, I want to share with you just a few of the results of the surveys that we did. The Maine Butterfly Survey officially ran from 2006 to 2017, but we continued adding data from web sources right up until the book went to press last year. The Maritimes Butterfly Atlas, the similar project that was run in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, did exactly the same thing. And so we merged the results of these two projects in this region. And you can see what happened in terms of the number of records added by those two surveys. It was an exponential increase. And that graph alone makes the point of the value of citizen scientists, people that get trained by people like me to collect data just the way I would collect it. And they turn into an army. Over 800 people participated in these two survey efforts and dramatically changed the face of our knowledge of this important group in Maine and the Maritime provinces. A quick table from the book. I'm just going to point out the fact that the survey found 8 new species in Maine that we didn't know were here, and 1 new species for the United States. I'm adding this species because this was actually found after the survey was over and now has been found several times since then. In the Maritimes, 13 new provincial records and 4 new records for the Maritimes as a whole. When we look at the diversity, the number of species in the region, we can produce something that's called a heat map. And so the closer you are to red, the higher the number of species found in that region. The cooler the color, blues, the lower the number of species. So you can see the southern coastal region of Maine has the highest number of species in the region. And this is probably related to the growing seasons. And if you know anything about biophysical regions, you know that this particular region is a different region than this region of Maine and much of the Maritimes. So a very different growing season, I think, might explain the really high species diversity here. What we do know is we have 123 regional species. In Maine, 121 regional species, 95 are residents, 7 are colonists, and you say, wait a minute, 95 and 7 does not add up to 121. And the reason it doesn't is because we have these transients, these strays that fly into Maine, get recorded, but they're actually not breeding here. They're not colonizing, or at least not colonizing yet. The Maritimes, slightly lower, 93 species, 76 residents, and six colonists. And again, they also have some transients. Well, I can't go through all 123 species with you in the time I have tonight, but I want to give you a flavor for the diversity we have in Maine, because it's actually quite extraordinary. And so I'm just going to hit on a few of the subfamilies in each of the families that we have. These are pictures all from the book, and I've provided the attribution for the photographers. So our first family, of course, are the Hesperidae, the skippers. And this family is divided into subfamilies. We have now 36 known skippers in the state. One subfamily are the dicup skippers, and this northern cloudy wing is a great example of that. The second is our largest skipper species, the silver spotted skipper. Really easy to identify because its name, the underwing with this big silver spot. The next subfamily would be the spread wing skippers, and it includes animals like this wild indigo dusky wing. And this common sooty wing. Now, the common sooty wing is a good example of a transient. It's not known to breed in Maine, and yet seems to appear here from farther south every year. The subfamily known as the skipperlings, only one known species here in Maine. That's the Arctic skipper, beautiful little butterfly. And especially if you see the underwing, because it has these big silvery spots, much like fritillaries, which I'll show you later in a completely different family. The grass skippers are our biggest subfamily of skippers, 24 known species. This is the common branded skipper, also known as the Laurentian skipper. The common roadside skipper. You get these dark little skippers you can often see along the edges of dirt roads, males displaying to one another. Again, about as big as your thumbnail. The Hobelmuck skipper, very common skipper in Maine during the summer. The dun skipper, because of its dun coloration, again, very common midsummer, late summer in Maine. The cobweb skipper, this is a listed species in Maine. This is a species of special concern, very rare. The Ocola skipper just started appearing in Maine about a decade ago. I've only seen maybe 3 or 4 of these guys in the state. More southern species, very dramatic. It's part of the long-tailed skippers. If you see it, you'll recognize it immediately. The European skipper is the most common skipper in both Maine and the Maritimes, and as the name implies, it is not native. It was introduced in Ontario probably around 1910 or so, and has become very successfully established. The next butterfly family are the swallowtails. We have 7 species. The eastern tiger swallowtail is one that most people don't see. It's found in, tend to find it only in the southern part of the state. It probably does not breed in Maine. It migrates into Maine. We tend to see instead the Canada tiger swallowtail, which will look very similar to this and is found throughout the state. The black swallowtail, very easy to see, fairly common. People tend to see this quite often. The spicebush swallowtail, southern Maine, species of special concern. I'm just going to flip back. Notice the difference between this butterfly's color pattern and this one. And an interesting swallowtail, our largest butterfly, the eastern giant swallowtail. Interesting butterfly. First recorded in 1886 in Maine, not seen in Maine again until 2011. And now known to breed. We have breeding records of it in Farmington and now at the Maine Botanical Gardens just this year. So this species appears to be establishing its residency here. The whites and sulfurs, the Pyrrhidae. We have 9 species of these. In the subfamily that are the whites, we have the mustard white, and I'm just going to flip back. That's also the mustard white. Okay, so this is the spring form, and that's the summer form. So they can take on 2 different morphs. The one that most people are familiar with, of course, would be this one, very commonly seen, the cabbage white, and also referred to as the cabbage worm because its caterpillars are, yes, those little green worms you find in your broccoli and kale and so forth. This is what they grow up to be. We have the subfamily that includes the sulfurs, the yellow butterflies, 6 species of those. This is the clouded sulfur. This is the orange sulfur. Note the orange here. And this is our, as of this year, official state butterfly, the pink-edged sulfur. I just want to call your attention to, they think, oh yeah, the pink edge, I see that. If we go back, you notice that has a pink edge too. And that has a pink edge too. So what you really have to pay attention to is the color of the wings and these spots on the underside of the dorsal wing. Notice there are 2 here. There are 2 here, but this one's greatly reduced, and we have this orange pass, which is even more vivid on the top surface of the wing. But here we have only a single spot. There is no little orbiting spot. And so that's the key discrimination that you need to make. The Lycaenidae are the gossamer wings. These include the harvesters, of which there is 1 species in the state. And this butterfly is unique because it's the only butterfly in the state whose larvae are actually predators. They're predators of aphids. They're not herbivores like all the other butterfly caterpillars that you see. The subfamily includes the coppers, which there are 6 species. This is the most common one we see, the American copper, beautiful little butterfly. The bog copper, also neat, but as the name implies, found around bogs. Clayton's copper. This is on Maine's threatened species list. The subfamily that includes the hair streaks and elephants, beautiful butterflies. Okay, this is a really vividly marked coral hair streak. This is Edward's hair streak. This species is endangered in Maine. Hessel's hair streak, again, an endangered species in Maine, and you can see the kind of habitat that you would expect to find it around. Another brilliant but endangered species in Maine, the juniper hair streak. The next subfamily includes our elfins, and this one is particularly common, the eastern pine elfin. Again, these are small butterflies, just, thumbnail, a little bigger than a thumbnail. brown elfin. Also, you can see, so based on the flower size, how big this butterfly is. You have to look careful for these guys. This one, the hoary elfin. This is a species of special concern, somewhat much more rare than the other two species. The subfamily that includes our blues, and the reason I'm showing you this particular image is because the dorsal surface of these guys is sometimes vibrantly blue, but not the ventral surface. So mostly you identify these guys from the ventral surface. So 9 species. We have the western-tailed blue. We have excuse me, that was the last one. This is the northern blue. Just go back. You can see why it's called the western-tailed blue here. Okay. The silvery blue. And again, you can just get a hint of blue along the margins of the wings. So the dorsal surface of these guys is quite blue. One of the most common blue butterflies that most people see, especially early in the summer season, are the azures. Okay. And this is the northern azure. And again, you can see the top of this guy's wing is in fact blue. This particular species is a little problematic because it comes in 3 different morphs, right? So there's the marginata morph, the lucia morph, and the violaceae morph. But again, this is probably the most common blue that people see. And then our last family of butterflies are the Nymphalidae, the brushfoots. And when people see these, they say, whoa, wait a minute. Insects have 6 wings, but these guys only have 6 legs, but these guys only have 4. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's because the nymphalids' first pair of legs is very short, kept folded up here and not used for walking. It's used for tasting. So when these guys land on a particular host plant, the short legs will come out and do this. And what they're doing is literally tasting the plant for chemical signatures. So within this family, we have the subfamily that includes the snout butterflies, of which there's the 1 species. This is the American snout, and you can see why it was named that. These are actually part of the labial palps and probably lend to the crypticity of this particular species. It's kind of looking like the leaf stem of a dead leaf. The subfamily that includes the milkweed butterflies, of which we have a single species, the monarch, shown here. The subfamily that includes the longwings, which we don't have, and the fritillaries, which we have 10 species of, most of which have these brilliant silvery spots on the undersides of the wings. So this is the Aphrodite fritillary, the bog fritillary, great spangled fritillary, our largest fritillary. Our next subfamily are the admirals and the sisters. The white admiral, which was the symbol for the Maine butterfly survey. Brilliant butterfly, pretty easy to pick out. The viceroy. And I frequently get people confusing the two, so a quick comparison. There are a bunch of different ways to tell the difference, but the easiest way to tell is the existence of this median band on the hind wing. It doesn't happen on monarchs, just the viceroy. And when you see these side by side, viceroys are actually quite a bit smaller than monarchs too, but that's the easy tell. You can spot that a fair distance away. The next subfamily are the true brushfoots, and they include things like this brilliant Milbert's tortoise shell with its nice cat's eyes showing here on the 4 wings. The first butterfly we tend to see in the spring because it overwinters here is the mourning cloak. A frequent colonist in Maine, the really dramatically colored common buckeye. One of our migrant species, the American lady, and the very similarly colored painted lady. Again, I'll give you the quick tell on these guys. There are a couple of different ways to tell, but when you see the underwing, notice 4 really discrete, about same sized eyes. Go back. 2 much larger eyes by contrast. Neither of these butterflies, we have no evidence that they actually overwinter in Maine. They may produce 3 generations while they're here in the summertime, but then they leave. Their overwintering strategy is to migrate. The red admiral, actually not even the same genus as the white admiral, so a different butterfly altogether. Also one that does not overwinter in Maine. We have 2 species of crescents. This is the northern pearl crescent. And we have butterflies known as checkerspots, and this is the Harris's checkerspot. I started off my presentation with the very vibrantly colored Baltimore checkerspot. We have this interesting subfamily of butterflies known as the anglewings, and you can see why they're called that. This one is pretty easy to identify when you see it. It is the question mark. This one is one of our commas. There's the comma here, and this particular one is the green comma. This one, again, a comma, is the hoary comma, and this is a comma of special concern in the state. The subfamily that includes the satyrs. Okay, 9 species. These tend to be brownish butterflies for the most part. So this is the little wood satyr. This is the northern pearly-eye, and again, these butterflies tend to be frequent forest edges. We tend to find them. Northern pearly-eye. The most common butterfly in Maine and, in fact, northeastern North America, common ringlet. Okay. You can see these guys virtually all summer long. Our rarest butterfly. This is the Katahdin Arctic. It is only found in one place in the world, and that's on the tablelands of Mount Katahdin. So that's its entire global range right there. Now, you've heard me mention listed species, so I just want to show you a quick map of those. There are 24 state listed species. Maine has its own Endangered Species Act. Almost every state does. The federal government has an Endangered Species Act. Anything that is on the federal government list is of necessity on the Maine list. But there can be things on the Maine list that are not endangered in other states. So right now we have 24 state listed species. This is in order of increasing imperilment. So we have 5 that are endangered, 3 that are threatened, 13 of special concern, and 3 that are a great conservation need. So each one of those is an increasing level of imperilment. These 2 get special protection by law. You can see, again, these tend to be concentrated in southern Maine. So what are the threats to butterflies in the region? As it turns out, There are lots of threats. It depends on where you are in Maine or the Maritimes. I can't talk about all of these. In fact, I can't talk about even a few of these. These are the four big ones: development, pesticides, ecological succession, and climate change. I'm just going to focus on climate change. It's in the news, right? The most ardent climate deniers cannot now deny what's happening in terms of the world's climate. So, what's the deal with climate change and butterflies? How does that impact butterflies? Well, we know we now have a longer growing season. Spring comes 2 weeks earlier. Fall lasts 2 weeks longer. And the growing season, on average, in the lower 48 is 2 to 3 weeks longer. That's more pronounced in the western states than it is in some of the central states. So you can see the darker the green, the greater the extent of the change in the growing season. But how does that relate to butterflies? Well, it means earlier flight periods. Butterflies are flying sooner than they used to fly. It means later flight periods. They're flying later into the year. When you say, so what? So the butterflies are around longer. Well, remember, the butterfly life cycle is centered around the host plant required for the caterpillar. And what we're finding is something called temporal mismatch. That is, the breeding cycle of the butterflies in some species is no longer in sync with the host plant breeding cycle. And that could be catastrophic. We're finding butterflies are shifting their geographic ranges. And you could say, well, so what? Well, butterflies have been in Maine probably since they recolonized after the last glaciation 10, 12, 14,000 years ago. They have, because of their rapid breeding ecology, pretty much gelled into a assemblage that's stable in the region. Now, new butterfly species are pushing into the region, and I'll show you a couple of examples. How's that going to change the dynamics for the existing butterflies in the region? We're seeing changes in body size as a result of warming temperatures. That has an impact on energetics and an impact on food demand. We're seeing, in some cases, changes in behavior of butterflies. And again, that may impact the success of a particular butterfly population. For example, if a butterfly starts breeding on a host plant that's in fact toxic to that species, that has a dramatic impact on the populations of that species. We already have some examples of that. Changes in volcanism. Volcanism is the term that's used to describe generations per season in insects. So a univoltine species breeds one generation, bivoltine two, multivoltine, well, multiple generations. And with warming temperatures, we're seeing a change in volcanism, which may not be coincide with plants required to support larval development. Changes in butterfly communities due to new species. Now, here I'm not necessarily talking about new butterflies moving into the region, but all those other things that are moving too, right? In Maine, we talk about ticks, the movement of ticks north and inland, right? It's not just ticks. Predators, competitors, parasites, pathogens. There's lots of things that are changing their ranges. So do we have any evidence from 17 years of data? Well, more data, because we actually have historical data too, in terms of butterflies. We do. And I'm going to make this table easy for you. We looked at 10 species with at least 500 records, and here's what we found. Every single species is breeding or is appearing either earlier or later, and in 4 species, both earlier and later. in our region. So we have clear evidence that climate is impacting butterfly biology. This butterfly was not recorded in Maine prior to 2008. It is now well established in southern Maine and breeding here. This butterfly was not recorded in Maine prior to 2009. It is now well established and breeding in Maine. Butterflies are moving north, along with everything else. In the book, we predicted these 20 butterflies were possible in the near future in Maine. Well, you know what? This one appeared in August for the first time ever, as did this one. So 2 of the 20 are already here. I'm always asked about monarchs, and yes, monarchs are in decline in their wintering areas, no doubt about it. We see this in the news all the time. They have been proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered species protection. They've been recommended for that, but they're not high on the priority list. That said, some recent studies of records of actual butterfly recordings in various places in the country indicate it might not be as dire as that. There are dramatic declines in the migratory populations associated with the Northeast and the Midwest. No question about that, because of what's happening in their wintering grounds in Mexico. But the data suggests that butterflies in the Northwest and Southeast might be actually much more stable. And so what we might be seeing, because of the reproductive potential of these butterflies, is kind of a density-dependent reproduction that's balancing the mortality losses that we see in the Northeast and Midwest populations. Is that going to continue? Climate's continuing to change. Somebody said, oh, everything is going on. It is the new normal. It's not the new normal. It's the beginning of the change. Okay, we're going to continue to see that change. Additional studies of butterflies in North America suggest this. 48% of species are showing a 1% per year decline. 26% are showing a 1% per year increase. That may be competition being relieved or conditions being more favorable, hard to say. There are certainly hotspots, particularly in the Southwest, with lots of declining species populations. Some increases, Pacific Northwest, a little bit in the Southeast here. The drivers, temperature, precipitation. High temps, low precipitation foster declines in butterflies. The very things impacted by climate change. I'm going to finish up real quickly here. Everybody probably has seen reference to this. There are a whole bunch of books out on the insect apocalypse. This was the New York Times article. I'm asked about this all the time. Are insects declining? The short answer is some are, for sure. No question about it. Well documented, especially pollinators. There have been lots and lots of very well documented cases of declines, particularly in bees. Really, really clear declines, dramatic declines. Is that the global pattern for all insects? That's absolutely not known. It's a really complex issue. Our historical data for insect populations are often very poor. Insect populations can fluctuate really dramatically from year to year, depending upon conditions. We see lots of variability in population trends in insects based on their species, the region you happen to be surveying in, the habitat you happen to survey, and understanding that lots and lots of things impact all of those in terms of the number of insects in a particular area at a particular time in a particular habitat. And there's lots of papers out there that address all the various things, pesticides and fire regimes and drought and so forth that can affect. So it's There's a very complex issue. Would I be surprised if insects worldwide are declining? Not at all. Do we have the data to say that? Absolutely, we do not. We absolutely know some groups of insects are in decline and been in decline every place that we look. How climate change impacts all that, I can't imagine for the better. That has, of course, resulted in the call, actually, of the previous administration, the Obama administration, but by a number of scientists for a national pollinator monitoring program. And in Maine, what we've tried to do is not maybe focus on pollinators so much, but focus on key important ecological groups. All right. By way of conclusion, I always get asked about resources for identifying butterflies. If Maine and the Maritimes, that's the only book I know. If you want the East Coast, either of those two books are excellent. If you want all of North America, the two on the right side are excellent books. If you want caterpillars, those are probably the way to go. I own all of these. They're all excellent books. If you're thinking of ordering this book, please don't do it on Amazon. Just go right to Cornell University Press and plug in that, and they'll give you a third off the price. I'm not trying to sell the book, but don't pay more for it than you need. I will also point out we have the web resource, the Maine Butterfly Survey. Okay. And there's a cat chase in the background, sorry. You can go on that and find images of butterflies and distribution maps for that group. There are a number of excellent apps for iPhone and Android. The Seek app associated with iNaturalist, but also a variety of additional kinds of apps, including LEPs, picture insect, and so forth. So there are lots and lots of resources out there to help people get into this fascinating hobby or lifestyle. In conclusion, I want to thank my co-authors on the book, and especially Philip de Menaudier, Herb Wilson, who worked with me on the Maine Butterfly Survey for a long time. Brian Pfeiffer for his amazing photographic editing, including the cover of the book. And really importantly, the 861 citizen scientists worked on both of these projects. And especially all of my many cohorts of UMF students who engaged in all of these insect projects with me over the years. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that are out there.
Thank you so much, Ron, for inviting us into the world of butterflies. I have to say, you have such a soothing voice. When you were going through the slides of all of the different kinds of butterflies, I was like, this is like a meditation on butterflies. It was so beautiful and soothing and really informative. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box right now. We're a little over time, so maybe we'll take one or two. If anyone has any, if that's okay with you, Ron.
Absolutely.
It was a very thorough presentation. We're getting thank you, wonderful talk, the chat box, some thumbs up.
So Ron, I actually have a question, and other folks may have this same question while we're waiting for some people to process and potentially put in a question in the chat box. So you had over 800 people participate in the citizen science survey, which is awesome. That's an incredible number of folks. How could people become involved in that? Is that something that you open up widely to the public, or is that something that you actually invite people to participate in?
In all three of these surveys, we've opened up to anybody who wanted to attend the trainings. So no, it was not like a select group of people. It was, all sorts of people. We did, we'll say after our early experience, limited to adults because we found people were bringing, kids and the kids were really excited about it, but they weren't really, they were excited that day about it. Let's put it that way. And so they were, and we had a limited number of seats that we could sit people in to train them and so forth. And I'm frequently asked by all of these people, what the next project is going to be, right? What are we going to do next? I mean, we've done 3 of these survey projects, and now we've hit the last one concluded in 2018, and we haven't got another one off the ground yet. In part because we're working on the books, but in part because IFW is got its hands full in terms of other projects. But I suspect another one will come down the pike with IFW and possibly a Maine Audubon, sponsoring it. But right now, I don't know for sure. I'm voting for native pollinators, some kind of native pollinator project. But yes, it will be. What we always do with these is we have press releases and invite people to sign up, and then we hold trainings usually at one of the universities or colleges, and it's usually limited, but we have in the past done at least a couple of training sessions every single summer to build up the number of volunteers out there with cameras and nets and so forth.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple of questions in the chat box. So the first one is declines are declines deaths, or are they possibly relocating to another place?
Declines are, I think, better thought of as failure of reproduction. So what we're doing is we're looking at insects in an area that are reproducing, but their population numbers are going down. They're not necessarily dying, although some of them are certainly, I mean, they're all dying, but they're not necessarily dying because of the conditions. It's more likely that they're just not reproducing successfully. So relocating, not likely.
Thank you, Ron. Another question, are butterfly releases, like at weddings, etc., ecologically harmful?
So technically, you can't bring insects into the state without written permission from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife for a release. I think that if the release is of native species, then it's not an issue. Am I a big fan of it? Not really, but is it ecologically harmful? I don't think that takes place with enough frequency to make much of a difference. No.
The next question is, how close are we to having many air tags to track butterflies?
If I understand the question right, so we already we certainly put numbered tags on monarchs already to track their migrations. Are we talking about some kind of a tag that has a radio transponder or something of that nature in it?
I'm not sure based on what I see in the chat.
Yeah, the miniaturization has become increasingly awesome in terms of how small engineers can seem to make things these days. So I see, yes, a radio transponder. John and Deb, I don't know about that. I haven't seen anything to suggest that's on the horizon yet.
Thank you, Ron. And the last question, then we'll close up for the night. Where can we find out more about things coming down the pipeline? Would love to participate.
So as soon as there is any kind of project in the pipeline, the sponsoring agencies, and it's always been Inland Fisheries in the past, they'll do press releases. You'll hear about it. Right now, there is no project that I know of that's in the planning stage. We've been talking about it behind the scenes for a couple of years now. Do I expect there will be one? I do. Can I say it's going to be next year? I can't. I'd like to see one get off the ground, but it's not yet. Not yet. You'll know for sure as soon as there's one, we will release press releases and all the newspapers and so forth.
And is there a website that you would suggest people go to make sure that they're signed up to get those notifications?
So what will happen is you can check IFW's website because they certainly will announce anything like that. But we have always made a concerted effort, not only when a project starts, but every year to do press releases and all the local newspapers and so forth to make sure that people are well aware of the fact that these opportunities exist.
Wonderful. Well, I put a link, maine.gov/IFW into the chat box if anyone wants to make sure they're signed up for potential updates. And thank you so much, Ron, for bringing us into learning about butterflies and being inspired by the work that you've devoted yourself to.
And I can just add that anybody who wants to shoot me an email with specific questions, just butler@maine.edu. Feel free.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Good
Bye,
night, all.
everyone.